The other myth of enslavement was that the enslaved African hated himself. And that myth is also based on this idea that because of that, it was very hard for Africans to collaborate. Now, it's very true that on the plantation, that if you were planning anything in the way of running away or an insurrection, you had to be very careful who you talked to. And there were informants on the plantation. And the most likely ones were the ones, as Denmark Vesey said, when he was organizing his rebellion in South Carolina, they were the ones who had cast off clothes. That is, the master would allow those that worked in the house to wear his leftover clothes and eat his leftover food. And they had leftover minds. And so Denmark Vesey advised the organizers in his rebellion, don't try and organize them. He had Gula Jack who would do that. He was a voodoo priest. When he hoodooed you and voodooed you, then you would do like the house slaves for the governor of South Carolina did. They were prepared to poison the governor of South Carolina because Gula Jack had got to him. He put that spirit power of Africa on them. So if you look at the enslaved African, there were a variety of responses, but resistance was the overall mode. And the biggest form of resistance was in cultural resistance, because on the plantation, the war was between two cultures. One was the culture of what was becoming the new African, and the other was the culture of the Aryan or the European. And I should say this, that Aryan culture, and I'll go into this at another time, but the correct term for whites is not really European by root, because that's a recent phenomenon that you end up with what's called Europe. You had Rome before that, Greece before that. But the root of Europeans is Aryan. I'll go into this at another time. But the key point is, the war that Africans were waging on the plantation was between two worldviews and two cultures. And one that had a highly ethical and spiritual foundation to it, in which kindness, especially kindness towards each other, was central. And spirit was at the top of the culture. It was the high point of the culture. And so one reason that Africans did not embrace Christianity during enslavement was because, one, they came in with a deep spirit legacy that you call spiritual. Others call religious, a deep sense of religiosity, but it was really a spirit system. And the requirement in that system is that you had to practice what you preached. And what they could see with these whites is they were talking one thing and doing another. And many enslaved Africans described them as devils because their behavior was devilish. Don't think that term comes from the Nation of Islam. You know, it was just simply a description of behavior. So this was the world of the African. As we're forming a new African culture, as we come in here as saltwater Africans, we're bringing in a philosophy and a worldview. And it's in conflict with this Aryan one. And this is the key point to get about this Aryan one. In the Greek language, there is no word for right or ought in their language. And in all Aryan languages, what we now call European languages, there is no word for right or ought. You ought to do right or right. This is important. So when Plato talked about the good, he wasn't talking about truth or justice or what was right. When Socrates was forced, and he was Plato's teacher, Socrates was a great philosopher in ancient Greece. Socrates was forced to take hemlock. Why? Because he was teaching Greek students to treasure their souls, to live lives of truth, And what they said when they convicted him was he was teaching a foreign or alien philosophy. And that's true. That was a Kemetic philosophy that he was teaching. And so he was forced to take hemlock for telling his students to be truthful, because there's no word for right or truth or ought in the Greek language or in any Indo-Aryan language or European. Since Christianity, they have a layer over their thinking that has an ethical component, but that goes against the core of their nature. And if you want to understand Trump's appeal, Trump basically appeals to that Aryan philosophy. An uncaring, in this case, racist, because at that time, they had not, in the beginning at least, except for India, they had not formulated the doctrine of racism. So it's a very inhumane and savage concept. And so the African was at war with this. One of the mantras of the New African and the African in general, the African all over the world, is this: we are not going to be like them. We are not going to be like them. And so the average mother is teaching their children, the pride she will teach them is, you're not better than them, you're as good as anybody. So they teach them humility on the one point, not to be arrogant, and on the other point, to have pride. And some will teach them that they're better. So when we look at the enslaved African, the spirit of Africa draws on another quality, and it's a quality, not the one that's stereotyped by white historians and some Black historians and some Black psychologists of self-hatred. It's an attitude of love. And so the African who's described as being self-hating, the record would indicate there was something else going on other than hatred here. And again, I want to describe something else that Frederick Douglass had to say, because I think that it's representative of a whole lot of Africans. And it is a description of the relationship between Africans in general towards each other. Now, this wasn't all Africans. There were Africans that didn't have this experience, but largely it described this reality, the reality of love that Africans had for each other. Think about it. This notion that the African was basically living a life of self-hatred. Explain how that could be the case when the only care that you received in your life was from another Black person. Explain how that could be the case when you're sold, separated from mother, father, sister, brother, and strangers take you in and nourish you with kindness and love. How are you going to hate that? As one slave narrative, enslaved said, I didn't know mother, father, sister, brother. But he referred to the people that took him in. He said, they took me in, they loved me, and I'm okay. I'm okay. I think where you have extreme self-hatred, you have people who haven't been loved. You want to get down to psychological roots on this stuff. And you have a few like that. But in slavery, very few, because the extended family community took part, took care of that. And in the post-slavery period, when a Black person did not have in their life as a child someone that could hug them, love them, tell them that they were good people, nourish them, nurture them, those few that fell through the cracks, they're the ones that have problems. But that's not the general situation for Black people. So I'm saying we need to come up with some different terms that describe how Black people looked at themselves, because certainly after 249 years, we had scars and we had issues. And I'm not minimizing them. That's part of the reason why we need to go through this transformation of consciousness. But one thing I think is pretty clear, the record tends to indicate this, that African people came out of enslavement without an acre or a mule. We didn't get no 40 acres. We didn't get a mule. All we had was each other. And when Marcus Garvey, at the end of World War I, traveled across the United States and observed Black communities, he said this: this is the most advanced people in the Black world, in the African world, because he was an outsider looking in. We had built colleges, churches, businesses, multi-million-dollar insurance companies out of secret societies, by the way, that served as a springboard for this. We had built very, very impressive business infrastructure, economic infrastructure. We had built a number of Black towns. But we came out of enslavement without 2 nickels hardly to rub against, and no land, no mule. So something happened, and we came up at the end of enslavement with more inventions. The greatest inventors come right after slavery. I mean, if you look at all the things they invented, and a few years later, they had built the country. They had all kinds of ideas on how to create this and how to create that. But at the core of all of this was this attitude of love, that the only thing we had was each other. It might be confused love at sometimes. It might be problematic. It might be messy. It might be all kinds, but it was love. And in a lot of cases, real good love.